All right, welcome to This Explainer. Today we're diving into the fascinating and honestly heavily debated world of ultra-processed foods. We're going to cut right through all the hype and the panic to figure out what the science is actually telling us about the food we're eating every single day. We've all seen those alarming headlines about processed diets, right? It feels like every other day a new study comes out telling us what not to eat. But I want to start off by asking you a direct and maybe slightly uncomfortable question. Is your pantry making you sick? Take a second to really think about the foods sitting on your shelves right now. Okay, let's look at the reality of this. In high-income countries like the US and the UK, more than half of the average diet comes from ultra-processed products. But here's the truly staggering part. For some groups, especially young people, these foods can make up to 80% of their daily calories. Think about that. That means 4 out of every 5 bites they take are ultra-processed. It's a massive, fundamental shift in how humanity fuels itself. So, to unpack this whole shebang, here's our roadmap for the explainer. We'll cover the rise of UPFs, what they actually are, their alarming health and biological impacts, the big scientific controversy surrounding them, and finally, what the future of our diets looks like. Let's get right to it. Starting off with Section 1, the rise of UPFs and this undeniable global shift. Because this isn't just a Western phenomenon anymore, not at all. Driven by the massive industrialization of our food systems, globalization, and some incredibly aggressive corporate marketing, which, by the way, is often targeted right at kids, these ready-to-eat products are spreading like wildfire into Latin America, Asia, and Africa. They're systematically pushing out fresh, traditionally prepared meals all over the globe. Moving into Section 2, what are UPFs exactly? We really need to define the problem here. The absolute crucial piece to understanding this is the NOVA classification system. Developed by researchers, this framework totally shifts the focus away from just blindly counting nutrients, like fat, sugar, and carbs. Instead, it looks at the extent, the nature, and the purpose of how a food is industrially altered. Essentially, it asks, how heavily was this food engineered in a factory before it finally landed on your plate? This completely illustrates the stark contrast between, say, a simple apple and a chicken nugget. Group 1 is all about basic preservation, cleaning, drying, or freezing natural ingredients. But then you jump to Group 4, the ultra-processed foods, and we're looking at pure industrial formulations. They take whole foods, strip them down, and rebuild them using protein isolates, emulsifiers, colorants, and artificial flavorings. They're engineered from the ground up to mimic real food, all while maximizing shelf life and, of course, profit. That brings us to Section 3, the alarming impacts and health consequences. When you look at large prospective cohort studies, we're talking observing millions of people over time, it becomes glaringly obvious that this is a systemic issue. It sets off a domino effect in the body. Higher UPF intake elevates the risk for type 2 diabetes by up to 17%. For people eating the most UPFs, cardiovascular disease mortality jumps up by 50%. It even takes a toll on mental health, showing a 23% increased risk of depression. So we aren't just talking about a little weight gain here. We're talking about severe, full-body health effects. But I've got to say, perhaps the most eye-opening evidence comes from a landmark clinical trial by researcher Kevin Hall. His team discovered that people eating an ultra-processed diet naturally overate by about 500 calories a day compared to people on a minimally processed diet. And that was even when both diets had the exact same carbs, fat, and sugar. To put 500 calories into perspective, that's like accidentally eating an entire extra meal every single day. There is literally something about the food itself that drives us to overconsume. Let's dig deeper in Section 4, the biological impacts. How are these UPFs actually affecting our bodies on a micro level? Well, the biological mechanisms at play are deeply intertwined. It's not just one single thing. Sure, there's the poor nutrient profile of high sugar and sodium, we know that, but look deeper. Additives like emulsifiers might actually be altering our gut microbiota and kicking off low-grade inflammation. Meanwhile, the hyperpalatability of these foods is busy hijacking the dopaminergic pathways in our brains. They're essentially rewiring our reward signaling to make overeating a tough habit to break. And this all culminates in the disruption of what scientists call the food matrix. By mechanically breaking down the cellular structure of natural ingredients, the industry creates this soft, high-energy food that practically melts in your mouth. Just think about how insanely fast you can eat a handful of cheese puffs. Because it requires almost no chewing, you eat it faster, the nutrients absorb way too rapidly, and your body's natural fullness cues are severely delayed. By the time your brain finally gets the memo that you're full, you've already massively overeaten. Which leads us to Section 5, the controversy, because the science community is actually heavily divided on this.
We absolutely have to look at both sides of this debate impartially. On one hand, many scientists argue that the industrial processing itself is the real danger. They point to those cosmetic additives and the disrupted food matrices driving disease entirely independently of calorie counts. But on the flip side, critics argue that the NOVA system is just way too broad. They state that the whole ultra-processed label is really just acting as a proxy for diets that have always been bad, the ones full of added sugar, salt, and fat. They argue that some UPFs, like fortified plant-based yogurts, for example, really shouldn't be lumped into the exact same danger category as a sugary soda. And scientists also urge us to recognize the socioeconomic reality of all this. UPFs are incredibly cheap, they're highly convenient, and they are shelf-stable. Women in many cultures still disproportionately bear the burden of meal prep, and time scarcity forces a totally understandable reliance on these quick foods. We simply cannot broadly shame people for eating affordable, time-saving meals without addressing the systemic food access issues, the cost barriers, and the food insecurity that make UPFs the only viable choice for millions of families today. So, wrapping up with Section 6, the future of our diets and how we actually move forward. Here is exactly where the scientific community currently stands. We know global consumption is dangerously high and closely linked to chronic disease. We debate whether the foods are independent causal agents because of the processing, or if they're just markers of generally poor nutrition. And what we desperately need next are rigorous, long-term, randomized control trials. We have to clarify these mechanisms so we can start building public policies that actually work. Because right now, global policies are deeply divided. Brazil actually pioneered a new path by explicitly targeting ultra-processing in their national guidelines, advising citizens to prioritize home-prepared, fresh meals using the NOVA framework. Meanwhile, places like the US and the UK are still predominantly nutrient-centric. They advise reducing the bad nutrients, like added sugars and sodium, but they completely stop short of officially adopting the ultra-processed warning in their core directives. Ultimately, the science shows us that our entire global food environment is shifting rapidly right beneath our feet. We're consuming food that our ancestors literally wouldn't even recognize, all driven by a system optimized for convenience and profit rather than human biology. So, knowing what you know now about how these foods are engineered, how are you going to navigate your own pantry tomorrow?